Okay. Hello, everybody. Um, Here we are in our post-COVID-19 reality, which is, of course, a bit different from when we last saw one another. So anyway, here we are. I hope everyone is well. Good to be actually getting back engaged with the materials so that, I feel like my life has some rhythm and some meaning. So here we are. Before I get started on the lecture today, which is going to correspond to Crowther's chapter 6 in the text, I want to go over a few things about the new format and sort of where we'll be going from here. So, as I hope most of you have seen from the original email that I sent out about the restructuring of the course, I linked the new folders, which are in the drive, under the title weekly folders for remote learning or something to that effect. And within that folder, they're subdivided further by the remaining weeks of the semester. The first, of course, being next week. I'm recording this the Friday prior to next week's first virtual in-person session. So the week of March 30th to April 3rd. So that's your first week. So in this new format, a lot of your engagement with those materials, will be largely at your own discretion. So the weekly modules are intended to be, again, just a sort of bundle of materials that you engage with when you can. But in order for that to be advantageous for you in this new format, it would probably be good for you to have those materials read or covered by the time you attend the weekly meeting, which I'll talk about right now. So I'm going to set up every Tuesday and perhaps another day. I know at least one student can't make it to either of the currently scheduled 10:30 meetings, so I'm going to try to adjust that a bit. I'm not sure yet when it quite fits into my schedule, so something I still have to work through, but I think I can. But anyway, our first meeting is scheduled for our in-person Zoom real-time virtual meeting. Will be next Tuesday, March 31st at 10:30 a.m. And so we'll check in then and talk through things, kind of just generally touch base with one another. But typically how that session is going to work, I hope, is that is our equivalent to the keywords discussion sessions, equivalent to in-class discussion. So please come to those with questions, points you need clarified, points you would like to make, things you want to comment on, things that, stood out to you or impressed you in some way. So that's the idea. Moving forward, you're going to need to coordinate very closely between that weekly folder, that weekly bundle folder that's in the drive, and also the new syllabus, the new revised syllabus. Because in the syllabus, there are some things that are not in the drive, unfortunately, so I apologize for that. But all the externally linked materials are going to be in the syllabus, linked in the syllabus. So please, every week or whatever your schedule, if you're looking at it, say make a habit of looking at the syllabus and the weekly folder, say every day, Sunday at 3 or something. Check both and make sure you're getting all the materials. The folder, the Google Drive folder, will largely have the reading materials, which are all now PDF'd, including the Crowther text. So those of you who are depending on the library copy, they're there in the folder. All the remaining chapters, none of the chapters prior to the COVID adaptation. So the readings are in the folder, but then links again to external things. So the first one of these will be this coming Tuesday when you look at the syllabus, and you'll have an external link to two things. One will be this lecture, and the other will be a podcast called The Memory of Za'tar, the spice mixture that we talked about from the Gary Nabhan article, and A Free Palestine. That's the name of that podcast. It's an episode of a podcast series called, or series called Racist Sandwich. So they have a lot of great stuff, but this is the first one. This podcast, I think, goes nicely with the last two series of readings. So anyway, you'll engage with it, and hopefully we can talk about that a bit this coming week. The other materials, Crowther Chapter 6, which this lecture is going to correspond pretty directly to. I mean, I've integrated some materials from elsewhere, from my own experience and my own interest in things, but largely corresponds to Crowther Chapter 6. It includes the Sylvia Federici and others article or group materials, really. There's a brochure as well as a sort of manifesto from the Wages Against Housework era and movement. That was really intended for correspondence with Chapter 5 of the Crowther text, but I think it goes fairly well with today's readings as well, with this week's reading, as well. And then finally an article by Supski called Aunty Sylvi's Sponge, which is about nostalgia, cooking, kitchens. It also, again, is intended to correspond really more directly to Chapter 5's topics, but works well with Chapter 6 too, I think. So that's kind of the bundle for this week. So just kind of, get in the habit of starting to think about the materials and the course in a weekly kind of format. And that's kind of what we're moving to. And we'll see how it goes. 2 weeks in, we will kind of pause and reassess and see where we are. So I ask for your patience and flexibility as we work through this together. Okay, so as for lecturing, what I'm going to do from here on out, obviously I won't have this big preamble typically before lectures. So I'll just jump in, maybe say hey, and then I'm going to minimize myself on this screen so that you can just have full screen viewing of the lecture itself. And you'll just hear me talking, and I'll just go through the slides, and that'll be that. I regret, as I'm sure we all do, that we're not here together in going through the lecture so that we can bounce things off of one another. So I hope that we can still get some of that, I hope, in our weekly synchronous session. So we'll see how it goes. Like I said, we'll check back in 2 weeks and see what kind of adjustments we need to make. But anyway, welcome back. And I'm going to minimize this image and go ahead and start the lecture. Okay. So again, as I said, this one corresponds to Crowther Chapter 6. Which is titled, the chapter itself titled Eating In. And then the subtitle, of course, is Commensality and Gastropolitics. So it's really all about, it's about food in a shared context, and largely in a, although it does start to touch a bit on public versus private, there's one whole slide on that very issue. Really the next chapter gets into much greater detail looking at the public venue. But in this chapter, we start to differentiate between kind of meal sharing venues in the private and public spheres, and what that looked like through the course of time and across space as well. So yeah, we'll jump right in. Here we go. Okay. So we're looking at essentially throughout this lecture today, the sociocultural functions, and to some extent, socioeconomic functions of meal sharing. And that's really what our focus is going to be on. And I'm going to follow, I think it's a nice kind of simple format to frame this larger discussion around, but I'm going to follow Crowther's sort of when, where, what, why, who kind of framework. So we're going to start with meal times, as she does in the text. So meal times, and what we mean by this are, what she means by this, and what we're going to talk about today, are those times that we have scheduled aside specifically for eating, and how those are differential across time and space. So we take for granted, by and large, I think, the sort of structure of 3 meals a day, right? But this is, Crowther and others would argue, not some naturally developed system of eating, but rather a system that developed in response to a particular socioeconomic reality in this case. So in other words, meal times, when we eat, the times we have set aside for sharing meals typically, And that's another important component that we'll return to later, the commensality piece. It really reflects the social structuring of time and how we reckon with and keep time as a function of the socioeconomic organization of a given society. So again, to return to very early lectures on different socioeconomic strategies, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, you know, and horticulture and pastoral systems and all of that. All of those systems of socioeconomic organization, and we're thinking again of socioeconomic here, not necessarily in terms of making money, but making a living, right? Which at various times in the human experience has had absolutely nothing to do with money, but we've always had to make a living, quote unquote, right? So to feed and clothe and shelter ourselves. So of course, mealtime structuring would look very different in a hunter-gatherer society than it does in a sort of a capitalist industrial society like our own. And that shouldn't necessarily in itself be surprising at all. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this bar up here. It doesn't seem to want to go away. Anyway, we'll live with it for the time being. So this is a matter, there it goes. So this is a matter of sort of this differentiation that Crowther uses that I think is pretty helpful in thinking about this. Whether societies work to eat or eat to work, right? So this is an important distinction, and it's very simple, but it's very effective in sort of differentiating between a hunter-gatherer society, for example, that of course works to eat, and an industrial society in which we eat to work. Okay, we'll get into the kind of details and meaning of that as we go along, hopefully in this particular section, this slide. So again, the kind of 3 meal a day, the breakfast, lunch, dinner, or supper, depending on where you're from and what you call it. That sort of trio of meals, you know, occurring at certain times through the course of the day, is a very culturally constructed mealtime organization, right? And it's constructed around really the routine of our work days. And breakfast occurs, you know, before you start your work day, of course. But they've become increasingly, I mean, this was the same to some extent in pre-industrial society. I know the next point says that this is organized around the demands of industrial society and industrial time. It becomes increasingly so the more industrial our societies become. So, for example, in more agrarian contexts, breakfast certainly, of course, would have been eaten before you started engaging in your daily work routine. But lunch would have been a much more kind of leisurely activity, not necessarily an occasion for leisure, but a much more, you know, leisurely sort of engagement. People would have had a larger meal typically in the middle of the day than they would have either at breakfast or at dinner or supper time. And typically, you know, in an agrarian context, it would have been a family and or extended unit of some sort that shares work. Again, an important feature here of this whole sort of segment today, lecture today, and readings for today are sharing, the notion of sharing meals and the importance of that. But as we get into industrial society and industrial time, it becomes much more rigidly structured, right? So you have to be to work at 8 o'clock. Your lunchtime is from whatever, 11:30 to 12:30 or whatever it may be, you know, and then you get off at 4, let's say, and you come home and you cook dinner and you eat by 5 or 6. And then, you know, so it's very structured and it's based around sort of the flow and the demands, really more the flow that exists as a result of the demands of industrial society and industrial time. Whether or not you work in an industrial job in industrial society, you still operate on industrial time, right? So it structures everything we do, including, you know, what we typically do in colleges and everywhere. It's a way we organize ourselves. You know, at Sterling, we have very organized meal times, right? We eat at 7:30, we eat at 11:45, and we eat at 5:30. And so it's very much structured around the demands of our workday, so to speak, right? There are some other kind of mealtime functions that are a bit different in industrial societies, and depending on where you find yourself working, and that's really characterized, I think, mostly by the lunch break, right? So In some work contexts, I suppose people eat breakfast together or alone together. We'll get to that in a second. But most typically it's just the lunch break, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be taken as a meal with anyone. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experiences as I transitioned from sort of a life in the construction trades to a life on the other side of the desk, so to speak, and how this sort of lunch break really changed considerably in my experience there. But anyway, the lunch break in the classic sort of industrial factory system, where people were working and were physically working and expending a lot of energy, the lunch break was really, I mean, employers for a long time, would have no interest in giving employees a lunch break because it cut into productive time, right? But as we came to understand that, well, workers' productivity will recede in proportion to the amount of energy they have to expend, it became recognized that, well, we should probably have lunch breaks so that they can, fuel their bodies so that the worker can continue to be productive for the given work day, whatever that was. So there's very much the organizational sort of and energy productivity function of the lunch break. But it also has very much a social function, or it becomes kind of a social practice, or in some cases, a non-social practice of the workplace. And I think these two images are kind of pretty good indications of the range of possibilities there. I mean, not the full range of possibilities. I don't mean to juxtapose these as necessarily opposites, but they certainly represent a kind of different organization of sociality in a kind of shared meal context. So the one above, this is, some women welders on a lunch, not just women, but some men you see there in the background as well, taking a lunch break in a shipyard, a naval shipyard in California during World War II. And so, clearly, enjoying one another's company. And this is a very social event. It's an opportunity to talk about things outside of the immediate demands of work and sort of connect and bond and so on. So it can certainly serve those functions. The image on the right, this is from People's Commune Canteen in China from 1958. So this was a period in China's history from 1958 to 1962 that is known as the period of the Great Leap Forward, as it is known. And this was one of Mao Zedong's efforts to really modernize, in his estimation, in the estimation of sort of the more scientized communistic sort of perception of the world, to modernize agrarian China. And part of that effort was based around the reorganization of communal meal practices. So that meant assembling rural populations, rural peasant farmers into groups, collectivizing agriculture, right? So it would be a work group of, several hundred people who were assigned to a particular bit of acreage. No one owned that acreage. Within that sort of commune context, the people's communes, as they were known, there would be a canteen, and everyone shared their meal there. One of Mao Zedong and sort of the Chinese expression of communism and socialism, attempted to, particularly in the Great Leap Forward era, but also a little bit later in the Cultural Revolution era, which was kind of the second iteration of this, attempted to eliminate a lot of the older practices that were seen as carrying either some residue of capitalist practice, or were otherwise kind of antithetical to the collectivization of the socialist project, right? So the private kitchen was seen as a potentially non-communistic space, and so it was by and large replaced. The private kitchen was a target that was the communist sort of leadership sought to eliminate through the institution of these kind of communal canteens. Like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about, so when I made the transition from, I worked on construction crews. My dad's a builder, so I grew up working construction with my father, but then I went on to do some of that work, both after high school, during college, and after college, my bachelor's degree years. And in all those contexts, in the typical construction work day, it's in my experience, it was always the same. It was a 7 o'clock to 3:30 work day. And we would take our lunches sometime around, 11:30. And in that context too, it was always a 30-minute lunch. But even so, that 30-minute lunch, and typically, we would be on either remote job sites, or we would be on job sites where, we didn't have ready access to restaurants or other, pre-made food options. So most people would bring their lunch with them. And I found that not in every sort of construction crew context that I worked in, but certainly most of them, people would bring foods that, in some cases it was a very sort of routine kind of lunch package, right? It had a sandwich and a bag of chips or something, or to, cite an example like that. But then there were other crews I worked on with, diverse groups of people of various, ethnic and regional and even international backgrounds, who would bring foods that were important to them, leftovers from the night before, and so on. And it was a time when we shared stories about our foods with one another. And I always found that really valuable and interesting and fun. So yeah. And then I made the transition when I went to get my master's degree to, as I said before, the other side of the desk, with air quotes, where I worked a quote unquote professional job behind a desk alone for the most part, in my own office. And lunch really changed then. It wasn't sitting down with the crew to eat lunch. It was more of an isolated event. So I would go out I had an hour-long lunch period rather than 30. I could take it really whenever I wanted. It didn't have to be exactly at 11:30 or exactly at noon or whatever. I could take it at 1 if I wanted. I could take it at 2. I could not take it at all and leave an hour early. So I had a lot more flexibility in that regard. But typically, I ate alone for the most part. I would go get some lunch and eat alone. I got into a habit of listening to fresh air for a while on my lunch break alone in a church parking lot. So that was my routine for a while. But it became a very different thing, and I found that my coworkers too. And I don't know this is necessarily an indication of anything in particular, but my coworkers in professional settings were much less interested in kind of meal sharing conversations, right? Like, oh, what are you eating? That was always interesting, or part of the kind of the construction crew culture was like, oh, that looks good. What is that? Sort of thing. So the banter about what you're eating sort of faded, and that was kind of disappointing, honestly. But anyway, so meal times can have some bonding functions, some interactive functions that can be really great. Or some distancing functions, which we'll get to actually in a later slide. All right, moving on. So to look at, in addition to kind of the industrial and socioeconomic and kind of workplace structuring of time, meal times are also, this gets more into the realm of kind of festive meal times, which is the concluding section of this chapter, gets into greater detail about festivals and feasts, really. So these are determined largely have been historically and still are determined by religious calendars. So certain feasts that correspond to certain times of the year. And I'm not, and never have been, a promoter, advocate of like classic period European art, but I have for some reason always been attracted to the art of Peter Bruegel, and I've always really loved this painting, and I think that it captures a lot of things actually, but it's the title says part of it, the fight between Carnival and Lent. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the Lenten season and what that meant for people in the particularly Catholic Christian world. So Lent is basically this 40-day period of fasting and abstinence. Most people will give up something that they desire. Meat, exclusive of fish, meat was always commonly something that people might give up for Lent. But just preceding Lent is the Carnival period. So this is the season of festivity that culminates, of course, in the United States in the famous Mardi Gras parade. So Fat Tuesday. Fat Tuesday is the day before Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent. So Carnival was a season of sort of excess. And it was also a period that served a really important social function in that it kind of in Carnival proper, and not just the kind of larger festive season, but Carnival proceedings, parades, and things like that. It was a chance to sort of dress up and invert social norms so that the high became low and the low became high and that sort of thing. And many people have interpreted this over the years to be sort of a social safety net or safety valve function, rather. So, kind of a period to let off some steam where sort of inequalities were equalized for, if only a day or two or a week, but nonetheless, a period for sort of those things to happen. But Carnival was a period of tremendous excess, and it's represented by rich foods and lots of alcohol consumption and things like that. So we're going to move on to a detail here. So, take in some of the larger details from the full painting. This is, the full thing. You can see here kind of, well, I should point out a few things. So it's divided kind of right down the middle. If you look at the well right here, being kind of the center point, it's divided then to the left is the tavern, the beer hall, the pub, whatever. And these people engaging in dance and drinking and music and revelry of all kinds and some other kinds of foolery, people just dressed up in jester costumes and all of that. And then on this side, we have the church is here, right, in contrast, in deliberate contrast to the tavern. And then we have, people dressed up in, nun outfits, and people consuming and preparing fish in preparation for Lent, again, because that was permissible during Lent, and so on. So there's a lot going on here in terms of the contrast of these two seasons. And I'll talk a little bit more on the next. So we're going to zoom in to kind of what is generally considered the central scene of the painting. And that is this scene. So we'll go back here just to give you an idea where it comes from. So the scene that we're going to zoom in on is this scene here. Okay. So again, Carnival represented on the left and Lent represented on the right. And what we have here is a jousting match. And Carnival and Lent are jousting. But the symbolism and the representation of things here is what's really important. Again, Carnival is represented by excess, indulgence, absolute abandon, really, in many ways. And if you see, again, the person who represents Carnival, it's this fellow here on the barrel of beer. He's being pushed and pulled along by various revelers in costumes and so on. And again, the representation and the symbolism of what he has is important here. So he has a meat pie hat, and he has, of course, this meat skewer here with a head of some sort. I assume it's a cow's. I mean, it looks, not a cow, sorry, a pig's head, a chicken maybe or something, and some other small critters and sausage and so on. And of course, you got this big pork chop on the front of his chariot there. So again, this is representing the foods that were common for the Carnival season, but also the just abundance and excess, right? Very rich foods, very filling foods, very indulgent foods. And then, of course, Lent, represented by this very gaunt looking woman here. Most people interpret this to be a woman. The kind of beehive hat is a representation. It's a symbol of the church, so it's a representation of holiness and devotion and maybe divinity itself, discipline. Lent is a season of abstinence, right, and self-sacrifice and devotion. So that's what is represented here. Only certain foods, people typically give up, as I've said, certain foods for Lent, but they eat others, like pretzels, for example, are okay, and other kind of breads, but not meats, right? So once again, here we have this contrast between these two things that occur right next to one another in the religious calendar, but couldn't be more, the Catholic religious calendar, but couldn't be more different in terms of what they represent. And again, Lent, a 40-day fasting period lasting from Ash Wednesday until just before Easter. And it sort of is a commemoration of like other religious meals that serve similar commemorative functions. It commemorates Jesus's 40-day fast in the desert, right? So people give something up in commemoration of that event. And it's important to think about the time frame here. This painting was 1559, sorry, right kind of in the middle of the 16th century. And this was a time when there was a whole lot going on, not only the colonization of other parts of the world, but there was a lot of the Protestant Revolution was occurring through this time. So the Catholic Church and its basic tenets were, including its kind of ritualistic elements, were being challenged by the evolution of Protestant thought and the Protestant Reformation. That's really sort of the biggest change. And a lot of public officials, as Protestants came to hold more and more power, really started they engaged in this process known as the Reformation of manners. And, prior to this time, festivities like Carnival and the sort of anarchy and indulgence that it represented became very undesirable in the new sort of Protestant worldview. So they would often target these festivities, which had been part of common life for forever up to this point, really. Well, not forever, perhaps, but many of these festivals did actually correspond to earlier pagan rituals and festivals as well. So for a very long time. But the Protestant authorities, as they gained authority and became authorities, sought to basically eliminate, really was their goal, things like Carnival. So that's one of the reasons why in most of the Protestant descended colonies in the West, in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, you don't have the celebration of Mardi Gras. Of course, New Orleans and Louisiana are exceptions to that because of the significant Catholic population in the south of Louisiana. But in the Protestant areas, these kinds of indulgent festivities were and still are pretty looked down upon. And they thought that in order to sort of curb this indulgence and so on, that they really were trying to replace that with what one scholar calls the domestic discipline of the godly, right? So rather than engaging in all these sort of public indulgences and festivities, people should be devoted to their domestic life, to marriage, to work. Of course, this was the birth of the Protestant work ethic too, and that was very antithetical to this kind of sense of collective revelry that was part of the atmosphere prior to this time, when it wouldn't be uncommon to work and spend all your money on a big party, in as much as money was the sort of currency, so to speak, of the time. But the Protestants sought to reform all that. So anyway, the religious calendar can be very powerful in terms of determining meal times and what we eat during those meals. I'm going to look at one more example of this, and then we'll move to the next section, looking at feasting and fasting in the Muslim religious calendar. So we're going to look at the month of Ramadan. So this is the 9th month in the Islamic religious calendar. I hope the video works. It may not. Oh. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second, guys, and see. There we go. All right. So, right. Feasting and fasting. So during Ramadan, again, the 9th month, which typically falls somewhere between April and June in the calendar that we observe in the United States and other parts of the West. Ramadan is a time to commemorate, much like Lent, the first revelation of Muhammad, which was when the Archangel Gabriel descended and sort of delivered what would become the beginning of what would become the Quran, right, the holy book of Islam. And so during the month of Ramadan, the observant of Islam refrain from eating anything during the daylight hours during this month. And that is, again, from sun up to sundown, they fast. But there are meals on either end of that they're permitted to eat. So those meals are suhoor, which is the pre-dawn meal. So you wake up very early pre-dawn and eat your suhoor, and then you don't eat anything else through the course of the day until after the sun sets. And then at that point, you're permitted iftar, which is this sort of elaborate evening meal. These are very ritualized meals. Again, you know, they're embedded in these kind of deeper cultural identities. We'll watch this and then talk about it briefly. Again, I'm not sure. I hope this works. There we go.
It's an early morning in May. And for 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, now is also the holy month of Ramadan. Marked by 30 days of fasting from sunrise. Evenings are spent together with family over a breakfast meal called iftar. We followed 5 women in 5 countries as they prepare for this evening. I don't know what I'm eating. The day begins at 10 a.m. मेरा नाम रुखसबा है, मैं इंडिया से ताल्लुक रखती हूँ। आज रमजान में हम लोग पकौड़े बनाएंगे, भजिए, दूरी है और चना बटाटा है।
My name's Nancy Hawk, and I live in Pleasanton, California. I'll be making a traditional Bangladeshi iftar. We'll have boot, which is garbanzo beans. Also hot petis, which is meat stuffed in puff pastry. And also making some shrimp curry, because my boys love it, with some paratha. It's not hard to cook. Actually, if I think about it, I probably cook the most during Ramadan for some reason. Maybe because I'm not eating and I'm so excited about iftar that I want to make a lot of different types of dishes for my family and eat together.
This excitement is echoed, kitchen to kitchen, family to family. Bagian favorit untuk bulan Ramadan, tiap hari saya masak. Makanan yang saya bikin itu sudah ciri khas dari saya kecil. Setiap puasa itu mesti beli titik. Biarpun mahal, saya mesti beli ayam Jawa itu. Memang rasanya nikmat untuk dimakan bersama, anak cucu kumpul. But in Syria, the sentiment is a bit different.
والله هذا الإحساس كان من زمان بس هلأ ما في. لا بتحس بجو رمضان ولا بتحس العالم يعني العالم إنه على بعضها بالعكس. هذا الحكي كان يعني قبل الأزمة إنه العالم ما ضل حدا. يعني كل العالم أهليها سافرت أولادها ما عاد فيها الجمعة اللي عم تحكي عليها أنت. العالم أكثريتها تغربت وسافرت وشي اللي مات وشي اللي سافر وشي اللي هاجر. ما ضل هالأجواء اللي عم تحكي عنها ما عاد ضلت عنا. ما ضلت هالأجواء.
Overall, there is a sense of solidarity between the women in the kitchen. Amongst the frenzy of chopping and boiling, this is their domain. Here, they are all no.
तो मेरी मम्मी ने मुझे हर चीज मैंने मेरी मम्मी से सीखी ज्यादातर हम लोग का सब अंदाज रहता है और माशाल्लाह जब भी बनाते तो अच्छे उतरता है मतलब अच्छी डिश बनती है यानी हमारा जो भी आजकल लोग इस्तेमाल करते हैं ना आजकल की लड़कियां जैसे टेबल स्पून और टी स्पून
تعلمت على أمي يرحمها كانت شاطرة ساعات فما أكلات بالرايحة متاعها تعرفها يعني ناقصة ملح ولا زايدة ملح خاصة ناقصة ملح خاصة الشوربة أنا تو الشوربة حطيتها لا باش تجي شوربة أنا تمام مانيش كيفاش عرفت تو تشوف باش تجي شوربة باهية مانيش
والله هلا أنا بالنسبة إلي ما بقول فالحمد لله ولا مرة انغدرت يعني نظريا بعد يعني العيارات والله يعني ما في عندي مقادير يعني مثل بيقولوا على التجلي.
I learned to cook these dishes from my mom, my mother-in-law, and my sister-in-law. Each of them have their own take of recipes that they choose from. My sister-in-law is really good with shortcuts. My mother-in-law has a lot of traditional recipes, and my mom has the recipes that she made when I was growing up. So I like to just pull from each of them.
As the day progresses, the effects of the fast begin to set in.
بقى في المطبخ يعني ساعتين ثلاثة في خاصة في الطقس الحار معناها متعبة برشا.
हम उतना सब्र करते हैं, उतनी देर इतनी गर्मी है, शिद्दत की, फिर भी हम सब जितनी पानी की तलब लगती, प्यास लगती है, वो नहीं पीते हुए उतना किचन में खड़े रह के हर लेडी और क्या बोलते हैं बनाना बहुत टफ है, बहुत हार्ड है, लेकिन उस वक्त वो जो हिम्मत ऊपर वाला देता है इंसान को.
As sunset approaches and the time for the call to prayer nears, preparations for the iftar come to a head.
Raiden, I want you to wipe each mat. Ramadan is not just about fasting, it's about cleansing yourself. And so the 30 days forces you to reflect and think about all of that. And because everyone's doing it together with your family or your extended family, it's a way to reinforce that and see how can you be better.
And then everything stops. Around the world, echoing across landscapes, is the Maghrib, the fourth call to prayer of the day. With dates and water at the ready, it's time to break their fast.
Yang saya dapat di bulan Ramadan itu kebersamaan. Kebersamaan di dalam musola, itulah kebersamaan sama masyarakat. Apalagi yang sudah tua seperti saya, itu rasanya sudah enak, sudah mendekatkan diri sama Allah.
कि कब रमजान है, यूं तो सभी दिन अच्छे हैं, साल के 365 डेज अच्छे होते हैं, लेकिन जब रमजान आता है ना, तो वो एक ऐसा माहौल पैदा कर देता है कि हर तरफ एक रूहानियत लगती है, रौनक लगती है.
لانه لما بتشتهي انسان بتكون انت طبعا بتحبه، بتتمنى انه الاكل اللي انت عم تاكله الطعميه.
Ramadan is a really special month. The whole Muslim community is a part of it. And it's really special to know that we're all breaking fast together, no matter where we are. We might be off in timing a little bit, but this is one of the few days where we actually sit around the table and we eat together, which is really heartwarming.
Hi, my name is Beryl Sharashevsky. I produce the Ramadan Around the World series.
We don't need to see that. Sorry if you had any trouble hearing or seeing that. I didn't maximize it because I wasn't sure how my system was going to react. I have a pretty finicky internet connection here. I'm at my house. So sorry, you can watch it on your own if you'd like to see it again. It's really a pretty touching video. I think that really captures in 7 minutes really the essence of this chapter of the Crowther book. I mean, you know, everything is here. In this particular instance, we are looking at a mealtime that's structured by a religious calendar, but we're also looking at, you know, the ethics and sentiment of sharing food together, you know, in family units and community units and religiously based units. So meal sharing becomes, of course, deeply important and a carrier of a lot of meaning. And that's kind of one of the points of not only this chapter, but really the anthropology of food more broadly, is that food is deeply meaningful in so many ways. So this video also does a really good job, I think, of linking the last chapter where we left off. The last chapter, if you don't remember, was about cooks and the last two chapters, cooks and kitchens and recipes. So it was a lot of information on how recipes and cooking are transferred intergenerationally within households and other kinds of units and social units and so on. So a lot of continuity between the last chapter and this one. So very much what we're seeing here is this kind of structured eating event, right? again, structured by the religious calendar, also structured by other things, expectations. We get into that also in this chapter, in the next slide, as a matter of fact. So we'll go on and go there. But before we do, I want to ask you all to think about some other examples of meals from other religious traditions. A few probably come immediately to mind, and just think about those, and I hope we get a chance to talk through what some of those are that are, again, shaped by religious calendars. Okay, moving to the next slide. This is kind of the next piece of, a proper meal. Like this is the what, right? The first was the when, this is the what. What is a proper meal? And again, this is typically communally determined. This is not determined by an individual, although of course, it can be if we eat alone every day, that comes to constitute a proper meal. But the sense of that we're looking at in this chapter is really more of, again, meal sharing. This is what this is based on. And what then in commonality of sharing do we find constitutes, what is proper, what is good, and so on. I think, again, the video that we just watched, the short video, illustrated some of this, right? What is a proper meal? It's defined by certain culturally defined core staple foods. And we saw in all of those examples from the video, people drawing from a repertoire that included, core staples that were kind of deeply embedded in this kind of cultural matrix. Also sort of, of course, enhanced by these kind of peripheral foods, and those things all together equal a proper meal. I think to skip down to the techniques point as well, that was also demonstrated, I think, as was the associated material culture. I think all of these things were demonstrated in that film, right? So the techniques, several of the cooks talked about learning these techniques from relatives. So again, the intergenerational thing that links us back to chapter 5. But to jump back up to the ingredients thing real quick, Crowther uses the Ayurvedic. She returns again and again, of course, to Ayurvedic principles throughout the book. But in this particular case, what constitutes a proper meal, as it is defined in Ayurveda, is the combination of those hot and cold foods, again, that balance humors, plus the expectation of a starch, right? So rice or bread of some sort. And speaking of rice, it's one of the most commonly consumed foods in the world, and in many places, if a meal does not have rice, it is not considered a proper meal, right? Even if someone may get full in the absence of rice, it is considered necessary to constitute a proper, again, quote unquote, proper meal. And then, of course, there's associated material culture. This is, again, the what, like the seating. What kind of seating do you have? Again, this is culturally determined. It's not predetermined and universal. The kinds of tables or eating surfaces, in some cultures it's the floor. In some cultures it's, elevated tables like we're used to in the United States. The kinds of utensils that are used, how those utensils are arranged, all those sorts of associated material culture things make it a proper meal, right? And then finally, it can also be defined by kind of nutritional qualities. And this is one of the more, it is cultural. And that's kind of the point here, right? These official guidelines, and we're going to walk through a few of these of different sort of imaginings of food pyramids. So the food pyramid at the right, this is the 1992 USDA guide. They've switched now to the My Plate format, which is a little different. It's been revised, many times over the years, but this one from 1992, I think, captures a lot of what kind of trying to get at with this discussion. But these are, again, official guidelines, and they're determined not by necessarily any kind of particularly cultural affiliation or association. Although, again, I would say that in itself is an expression of the culture that's producing them. They're official guidelines that are based really more on, again, kind of the nutritive qualities of food, and not necessarily culturally defined core staples in these peripheral foods that enhance them, right? So, right. So, and they can and often are, and particularly the U.S. Food Guide Pyramid, and the equivalent in Canada and is also like this, is really reflective of the kind of normative standards of the dominant group of that society, right? So then you kind of wander into questions of, is this the proper meal, the nutritively proper meal for everyone, or is this grounded in kind of cultural norms? And again, the kind of the standards of the dominant group in a given society. So we see, again, looking at this, it's kind of represented here to some extent. There is a little bit of diversification, I suppose, but you get sort of these fairly unspectacular. I mean, I love broccoli. I love carrots. Love tomatoes, potatoes, and lettuce, not so much. Cabbage, yeah. Anyway, so these are fairly mundane vegetables, but they do the work of the vegetable portion of your meal, and that's kind of the point here, right? Everything is equivalent and substitutable. A vegetable is a vegetable, a fruit's a fruit. Bread, cereal, rice, pasta group, those again are kind of mostly the same. The meat, poultry, fish, dry bean, eggs, and nuts group, again, the chicken, right? The steak. They're not culturally specific necessarily. They are, found in many cuisines around the world, but they're not presented here in any culturally specific way. And then also, of course, the dairy group is similarly assembled here. So we're going to look at a couple more of these. I always find this a really interesting thing to do. So these two pyramids were developed by the Old Ways organization, and as it indicates at the top in the title, these are intended to be based on cultural food traditions, right? And so what is a proper and nutritionally proper meal sort of refracted through these slightly different cultural lenses, right? So the African heritage diet pyramid on the left, what do you see that's different here? There's the big category of greens at the bottom, and this is sort of getting at the historic role of greens in a lot of African descended cultures and cultures of Africa proper. Some very kind of African specific foods and or African diasporic specific foods, like the tubers here, the sweet potato. Actually, I'm not sure what this is. No, the okra's here. So there's okra here. Some potatoes, some things that are very familiar, tortillas and whole grains and pasta. And again, the ubiquitous carrot is everywhere. Peanuts, fruits, papaya here, and mango, right? And so you go back to this kind of very sort of, how do I say this, staid, kind of middle class, kind of mundane diet. And it has, the very basic fruits that you would imagine: grapes, apples, oranges, bananas. Here we get, a little more, again, in as much as this does not reflect the standards of the dominant group, it becomes exotic, but there's nothing exotic about it to the members of this group, of course. And then, of course, in the beans and peas piece, you get black-eyed peas, right? So this is another kind of culturally specific imagining of things. Again, the fish and seafood, similarly, eggs, poultry, and meat is a little more kind of generic. And then up here, this looks to me like probably sweet potato pie. Here you get moving over to the Latin American diet pyramid, you get some differentiated things. Again, this is a flan, right? And I can't really actually see that well enough to know what that is right there on the top of the pyramid. Again, the meat, dairy, and all of that looks mostly roughly the same. Queso fresco, here instead of like, pre-sliced cheese or something. And interesting that you get mahi here. And crayfish, which are not, or crawfish, crawdads as I called them when I was growing up. And then again, this kind of differentiated, culturally specific grouping of vegetables down here as well that includes, again, a mango, canela or vanilla, papaya once again, and avocado, which is not included in any of the others, coconut, and so on. So again, cultural food traditions. This is a meal, a proper meal that is both nutritionally and culturally significant in imagining kind of these kind of more nutritive centric imaginings of food. And one more exercise here. The Native American food pyramid on the left, this was put together by a group. I have the PDF document if you're interested in reading the rest of it. And you know, what's different here, again, acknowledging kind of cultural traditions. The bread cereal group throws in a bag of wild rice, which is interesting, an interesting choice. But then also these kind of more wild grains, I'm assuming. I mean, this looks just like wheat, actually. But then some interesting choices here, right? There's cactus for, both nopalitos and tunas, the fruits of cactus that could have just as easily been in the Latin American one as well. In the milk category, you know, this was not a huge category for Native American peoples pre-contact, so it's not there. Interestingly though, the ice creams up here, those are interesting. And here we have some wild foods, right? You get salmon, deer. Beef is included here too because it's common, of course, in many Native American households today. But wild game's included here as well, and that's a real departure, right? And acorns. So in this original sort of USDA food guide pyramid, I think it would have been hard for the nutrition scientists who were putting this together to imagine putting, a deer in the meat, poultry, fish, eggs group, right? But if you're speaking to a particular cultural group, you have to speak to their again, what constitutes a proper meal. And one more iteration of this. This is the Northwest Territories Food Guide produced by the Northwest Territory Health and Social Services Agency, an agency of the Northwest Territories provincial government. And this is also a native sort of food guide. And calling this whole group here bannock, which is a common word for bread in Canada and parts of the US, but mainly the Northeast in Canada. So you get a sort of reference point that automatically sort of speaks to, what constitutes a proper meal in this particular cultural group's imagining. And milk and milk substitutes. And what's interesting here are the bones, a lot of bones and seaweed here. So this is kelp. So again, integrating those things that are considered proper in this particular cultural configuration. A lot of wild game, once again, dried fish here. Seals and marine mammals and ptarmigans. I mean, these are very specific animals, right? Ptarmigans and salmon, once again, and muskrat and caribou, not some generic deer, but a caribou. And then down here also a number of wild foods. Here's some gathered things, right, in the bucket, but also including some store-bought foods like bananas and so on. So this is an interesting, all of these I think are interesting in imagining, and these are all, it should be said, I don't know how widely the old ways cultural food pyramids are distributed, but the effort was not to do this just as an exercise to sort of file away, but to actually distribute these to populations who would benefit from them. And the same is true here. So the Northwest Territory Food Guide is actively distributed in communities in the Northwest Territory. So this is one of those zones where kind of the scientized nutritional discourse attempts to kind of reconcile with more culturally specific ideas of what constitutes a proper meal. Okay, and moving on to the next one. We've been through the, what did we get through? We got through the when, and we got through the what, and so now we're on to the how. So the how of meal sharing, or the commensality. And you can think of this as basically the rules and the ethics and the implications of those rules and ethics for a meal sharing event. And again, this can be a very mundane meal sharing event, like having, breakfast with your partner or your children or whatever, or a more scaled up event, like a feast or a larger kind of festive meal. So in this sense, in the how, the rules and the ethics, what's important in the rules and ethics piece of this is that it is a way to perform social relationships, right? To perform deference and relationality to one another in sort of family units or social units that have predetermined social relationships. And also cultural rules of eating, right? This is another kind of big thing here. How do we eat? So we, there are certain governing things that dictate to us. I mean, we've all been told probably, I mean, I know that I certainly was, mind your manners at the table, or, use your table manners or something like that. So this is one of the hows of commensality, right? This is how meal sharing becomes embedded in sort of this social context. But it can also, etiquette itself, right? Table manners and what constitutes the proper how to eat a meal can also be a point of differentiation. It can lead to feelings of belonging or not belonging to a particular social assemblage, right? So we're going to talk about that a bit more in the coming slides, and quite a bit more in chapter 7 of Crowther. But it certainly, many of us have perhaps, I can speak for myself, I've certainly felt alienated in kind of elite dining situations. Not that I've been in too many of those, but where, the expectations of the proper placement of things and the proper sort of timing of various courses, for example, or something like that. I come from very much a working class background where, that sort of thing was just simply not part of my life growing up. But I have encountered it a lot in my adult life since leaving home. And I've certainly felt, very out of place by these kinds of rules of etiquette. And commensality also, we could think of meal sharing in terms of the how, think of it as a food-centered gift exchange. And this is, Crowther's effort to get at these kinds of anthropological categories of reciprocity and what that means, and what is what social sort of assemblages come to adhere in the processes of reciprocity. So she differentiates between these two kinds of reciprocity: generalized reciprocity, and this is when I cook you a meal and I share it with you, but I'm just sharing it with you just simply as a gift. I don't really expect anything back, but I know that in sharing that meal with you, or I think that probably in sharing that meal with you, that it will create a tie or a bond of some sort that we didn't have before. And if we're family, we do this for one another routinely, right? And we don't, I cook for my kids all the time, and I don't expect anything in return, although I do hope someday that they'll start cooking for me a little bit. I wish they are actually starting to. So yeah, we're getting there. The other kind of reciprocity that Crowther touches on is this balanced reciprocity. And this is this idea that, yeah, you give, and it is a gift. So you're either the giver or the receiver, but the idea is if you're the receiver, that you will return that favor. So this is balanced reciprocity, right? So that you give me something, I'll give you something. And then in this kind of gift exchange framework that she uses in this chapter, she also talks about redistribution and market exchange. But I think the market exchange piece fits much better in the next chapter, and we'll return to that. So redistribution. So the competition that can adhere in societal sort of structures can lead to status enhancement possibilities through this process of redistribution, she argues. So that, so for example, if I redistribute food if I'm someone in a position of power and there's someone else in the position of power, and we can, both of us, redistribute food to people who are not in equal positions of power, then we, through doing that, very much can enhance our status as people, as whatever we may be in that sort of elevated power scenario. So, a lot of power things play out. We'll get to that in some of the later slides here. I really like this painting a lot, the Tamalata painting. This is the tamale making party. I do this every year for my birthday, and it's something that I really enjoy and treasure. We as a family sort of get together and make a bunch of tamales and cook them, and it's an all day, all night kind of affair. It's great fun. And yeah, Tamalata. Okay, so now we're getting to the where of meal sharing. All right, and this touches on this kind of, as I touched on briefly earlier, this kind of public-private continuum. And so probably should have said this earlier, but a lot of these, the where, what, when, why, how, are not exclusive, right? So a lot of these categories sort of intersect with one another in so many ways. But principally here in the public-private continuum discussion, we're going to talk about these various spheres of interaction, of social interaction, and what kinds of cooking we expect, and what kind of atmosphere or what kinds of commensality attends to that. And the commensality, or the how of a meal, is very much determined by the where of the meal, right? So again, these are not mutually exclusive, but actually categories that build off of and shape one another. So in the public-private continuum, I mean, we start here, of course, in or maybe not of course, this is increasingly less so around the world, but in the domestic sphere, assuming that this is kind of, the original sphere of human activity for cooking and whatever else. And by the domestic sphere, this doesn't mean the sort of standard middle class, heteronormative family structure of, the car and the 2 kids and dog and all that, 2.5 cars and so on, but just domestic meaning the home, wherever and whatever that is. And the domestic sphere is the sphere in which, of course, you experience this kind of everyday home cooking, and home cooking increasingly has an elevated status, I think, as people sort of, and we'll talk about this, as people, she talks about anomie, right? This sense of being alienated from these older kinds of food production strategies and techniques, and increasingly as home cooking becomes rarer and rarer, not as a result of anybody's fault, other than simply adapting to the demands of again, time, and how we structure time as a society, and the kind of work demands that for a lot of people make it onerous, if not impossible, to sort of engage in home cooking activities. But again, the domestic sphere is one in which, it's familial, however that unit is defined. It's intimate. So, it's comfortable. You don't necessarily have to have any sort of social guard or wall up. It's, it's relaxed and intimate. There's also this kind of in-between sphere, the communal sphere. And this is the sphere of kind of shared feasting and festivities and things like that. And these can be shaped, I mean, very much like, the foods of Ramadan. Well, not the foods so much as the meals that are shared through the Ramadan period. So these are celebratory foods, they're shared foods. And again, as some of the cooks in the video expressed, these are meals that we expect every year at Ramadan. So they are associated with a kind of celebratory, shared, communal dimension. But they can also be in communal scenarios. There also then comes into play this, in some cases, not so much again in the videos we saw, but this host-guest dynamic, right? So if I'm hosting, I have a certain role. If you're a guest, you have a certain role. But they are nonetheless meals in which we have a certain shared understanding of what it is we're eating. But nonetheless, there's a kind of dynamic there with the host-guest thing going on. And then finally, there's the commercial sphere. And we can look at this as, when meals become commodities, right? So we go to a restaurant, we buy a meal. Because they become commodities, obviously they can, and again, the next chapter, we get into this in much greater detail, but they can carry with them, once a meal becomes a commodity, it can become a status symbol, right? So the ability to differentiate between, one kind of meal that cost X amount and another kind of meal that cost much less X amount is a way to sort of display status, right? And as sites of the places themselves can be sites of distinction. Again, that's for the next chapter. And they represent really an ever greater distancing between producers, preparers, sorry, that's misspelled, and consumers. So there's this increasing alienation in the commercial sphere between the meal you're eating as a commodity and the processes behind its delivery to the table, right? So, and again, in the domestic sphere, the home cooking meal, I mean, we could get as sort of fine-grained on this as we want, but it's conceivable in the domestic sphere, and certainly in many domestic contexts, this is the case, that, you would harvest, you would, so you produce, in other words, prepare and consume all in the same locality. Of course, you don't do that in the commercial sphere. You're alienated from each of those steps. And once again, sites of differentiation, but also sites of exclusion and social struggle. So, the image from the right occurred to me as, thinking about public eateries and Jim Crow laws in the Jim Crow era South that, were laws that legally segregated populations, right? So it was illegal under the law for African Americans to sit at segregated lunch counters. And of course, the lunch counter sit-ins of the late 1950s and 60s really catalyzed the civil rights movement and became this major display of social struggle. And they illustrated the exclusivity and exclusivity is really too kind a word really for segregation, right? It's it was cruel, really, on the basis of racial differentiation. This is a differentiation of a different sort, not a class-based distinction, but rather one based on race and access to public sites and really kind of the everyday power, right? I mean, this is not power in the sense of a big politician having lots of power, but in the sense of you and I, everyday people, having the power to participate fully in the sort of economic, demographic, socio-physical space in which we find ourselves, right? A lot of this is about space and place and the segregation of that space and place. So that's another dimension of the where of meal sharing that I think is interesting to consider. Moving on to the next one. If my computer may be seized up here, I'm not sure. Okay. Sorry, folks. Yeah, okay. Okay. Once again, I couldn't resist Bruegel again. So this painting, the peasant wedding, gets finally this last of the sort of what, where, when, who framework that Crowther uses in this chapter, and this is the who, like who do we share meals with, and what are the different dynamics in those varied sort of contexts, right? So with kin, with friends, or with strangers, and what do those mean, and what are the rules that govern those, and so on. So in these contexts of meal sharing, social boundaries are performed through these kind of standards, once again, of intimacy and distance, right? So, and there's a kind of this threshold of intimacy, right? So as far as the domestic sphere and kin and friends are concerned, and stranger, and where the boundary is that differentiates those two, it's this threshold of intimacy, right? So it goes back to this question: should we have them over for dinner? So in someone that you've never had over for dinner before, because in doing so, they are crossing that threshold of intimacy, right? And it is a deep intimacy, and there's certain people that you don't want to cross that threshold of intimacy, and strangers typically are not welcomed to cross that threshold of intimacy. But those who are either kin, who are always welcome to cross that threshold, or maybe not actually, to cross that threshold of intimacy, and friends who are most likely always sort of welcome to cross that threshold of intimacy. But it's about, maintaining those social boundaries that separate different kinds of people from one another as far as their relationality to one another is concerned. As far as the who of the meal sharing event, it's also a point of negotiation and performance of status. So there are certain gender ideologies and expectations that can be and often have been and still are expressed in meal sharing, right? So who's cooking, who's serving, that sort of thing. Age expectations, are children allowed at the table? In some instances, they may not be. And they might have certain other roles or functions in the meal sharing event. Kinship relations are also, again, it's this performance of status relative to other people, right? So it's not status in a hierarchical sense, but status in terms of just simply your everyday relation to someone. Kinship relations, you obviously have a certain kind of relationship with mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. And those kinship relations can play out in the meal sharing event, right? and their dynamics can be expressed. Class and caste, I think it goes without saying that those statuses are certainly negotiated and performed in terms of the meal sharing event, and inclusion exclusion dynamic once again. And then also, of course, very closely related is to particularly that last category, and other similar ones are the equality, inequality of power and authority sort of dimension of meal sharing as well, and who you're sharing meals with, and how those dimensions of equality and inequality or power are expressed in a meal sharing event. So a meal sharing event offers a person a certain opportunity to display social competence, again, to know which utensil to pick up for the given food item, to know when to pick up that utensil for the given food item, to know what follows what in the order of the meal. And this gives you an opportunity to enact a social competence that can, again, elevate you, can be a display of power, can be a display of authority and sort of cultural capital that others don't have access to. They're not privy to that, right? It can also be expression of reputation. And then, this idea of power over versus power to. Power over, just as it states, I hope plainly, that some people have power over other people, and this is very different than simply the power to. It's kind of what I was trying to get at actually in the previous slide with the access to lunch counters in the Jim Crow South. That is both, actually. It's the expression of both of those. There was a certain segment of society that was exercising power over another segment of that population, and that segment over whom that power was being exercised were denied the power to engage in a basic activity like sitting at a lunch counter and having a lunch there. So that's kind of the difference in power over and power to, and those certainly adhere in meal sharing events. So this is drawn directly from the text. This is on page 163, the eating event, and this is sort of adapted and drawn from Mary Douglas, a major sort of anthropologist of food who worked in the night before the anthropology of food was really a thing, actually. And so this is just sort of a nice sort of reference table for all of the things we've been talking about, right? And just to point out a few of the things, the meal itself and the preparation of the meal. Where does this knowledge, the acquisition of ingredients, where do the ingredients come from? The knowledge of what to prepare, where does that come from? The use of particular technologies and skills. What kind of skills do you need exactly? Who is preparing the meal again, right? Yeah, who cooks, who doesn't cook? Those sorts of things, private, public, away from home, and so on. The substance of the meal. Is it good? Is it even edible? Is it tasty or not tasty? Is this a staple kind of thing that makes it a proper meal, or is this some luxury item that has nothing to do with proper meals, but rather kind of an indulgence? Right, and then the structure of the meal. Does it have courses? Are there certain like expectations for seating arrangements? What's the shape of the table, if there's a table at all? What etiquette over is expected to be observed in the taking of a meal together? And the actors, so who, this is the who, right? So what's the social, it's funny that this term is being used so commonly today, social distancing. That's why we're doing what we're doing right now, isn't it? Because of what we've come to call social distancing for the coronavirus. But social distance in this sense does not mean, 6 feet apart. It means the distance between someone on a different sort of hierarchical scale, right? So that creates a social distance, right, between the worker and the boss, for example. There is a social distance between those two people. And there can be a social distance between eaters. For example, if the worker goes out to dinner with the boss, there is certainly a social distance there. And statuses and roles, those roles, worker boss and or, roles based on kin, age, gender, and so on can also adhere there. Are these inclusive or exclusive events, and so on. And then finally, what are the implications of all of this, of the eating event? What's the purpose of the meal? Is it just simply daily sustenance? Is there equality in that meal? Is there solidarity expressed in that meal, or some kind of intimacy? Does it reinforce a social order? What about identity? Is it communicated? Is it constructed in that event? Does it demonstrate cultural capital, right? Those sorts of things. so this is a nice kind of index reference to the larger sort of framework that Crowther uses through this chapter. Again, page 163 if you want to reference it. And then finally, she talks about a few kind of, we're closing in on the end here, gastropolitics, which is basically this idea that power and power dynamics and social relations that are expressed through power dynamics, of course, adhere in the consumption, the production, the processing, the purchasing of food. And of course, it goes without saying, I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is precisely an expression of gastropolitics, right? Crowther references the framework that was developed by Arjun Appadurai, and he talked about how food can do one of these two things. It can either, and I'm sure many others in between, but it can either homogenize a group of people, and it homogenizes through various sorts of mechanisms or vehicles. And this, you know, the vehicle of intimacy will serve to homogenize, to create an equality among the people or solidarity among the people, right? So all these things are expressed equally through the homogenization function of meal sharing. But it can also heterogenize people. And this can be done, or differentiate people. And this can be done through, again, some of the things that we've already talked about, through the social distance between the actors engaged in a particular meal sharing event or eating event, their respective ranks, and the stratification that might be expressed in that as well. This photo, kind of a solidarity piece. I mean, I suppose we could ask ourselves, you know, if an event like this is homogenizing, if what we're seeing here is equality, I certainly think we could call it solidarity. I don't know how much intimacy would adhere. This is, by the way, I didn't say, a volunteer citizen-run soup kitchen that was, you know, just set up by people trying to help one another in post-austerity Greece, after many of the social services that had been common in Greece were eliminated through a neoliberal reform period. So yeah, people helping one another. Certainly solidarity, intimacy. Yeah, I don't know. It's certainly not like gathering around, you know, a family table for a meal, but there could be a great deal of intimacy there as well. There's certainly some level of it. So a good example to sort of think through. All right, so the last part of the chapter talks about feasting occasions, and talking about feasting occasions as this kind of really distinct and differentiated category of meal consumption. I pulled this photo, if you can't tell, off of the internet, stock photo. It was kind of a good one, but anyway, in the feasting occasion, what we have is what one scholar calls a total social phenomena, right? So it basically encompasses the totality of the cultural sort of what Pierre Bardou calls the habitus of a culture. We come to embody the cultural norms that we live and learn through the course of our lives, and all of that is on display at the societal level and negotiated through feasting occasion, argue some scholars. Feasting occasions have certain characteristics. They are, you know, some of these are quite obvious, you know, a surplus of food, clearly, you know, and a huge abundance of food. Often, but not always, a similar abundance of alcohol. We can go back to that Bruegel painting and the representation of alcohol, excessive amounts of alcohol through Carnival, for example. They usually always include more participants than a daily meal. This is one of the things that sets them apart from daily meals. They're consumed by communally defined groups, typically. Very broadly conceived, okay? So it can be a family, a clan, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a regional group, it could also be an occupationally defined group, right? It could be an office group gets together for a feast of some kind. They're generally pretty lengthy, so this is not the kind of thing you sit down for 30 minutes and eat and you're done. You know, this is like an all-day event or a half-day event or maybe even a multi-day event. Right, it usually involves a display of special foods that are not consumed at other times. making it like a very distinct and memorable event. I'll offer you one example of this. There's an event that a friend of mine back home has been hosting every year for, gosh, I guess about 15 years now. And the very first year we hosted it was the same year that my wife and I got married. And at our wedding, this friend was in charge of getting some of the food for. Well, we had actually ordered some barbecue. We got married in Ohio, but at the time we lived in Texas, and we had some Texas barbecue ordered for the event. And so he went to get some sort of complimentary side dishes, and came across this place where they had this thing called it was a little Cajun restaurant in Cincinnati, Ohio, of all places, called the dish that is was called Tony's Happy Corn. So he got it because he thought that would be kind of funny, and it was basically probably a third of an ear of corn that's cut into a third of an ear. It's battered in a sort of spicy tempura batter and fried. And so we had that at our wedding, and then at the first of these sort of very much feasting occasions that we have every year, he duplicated the Tony's Happy Corn, and we've had it every year since. But we don't have it any other time of the year, right? So, and there's other things we have at this event too that we don't have at any other time of year, including a pig that we cook in the ground and other things. But so special foods that make it very memorable and very distinct, and mark it off as kind of this this occasion that is not an everyday occasion, right? And sometimes there's also the last point here, the dramatization of the social order through ritual and performance. Sometimes this accompanies, and sometimes this is the purpose for a feasting occasion, is sort of dramatization of social order. Right, and so she, again, Crowther distinguishes between these various kinds of feasting occasions. I don't necessarily want to dwell on these in any great detail, but she talks about the celebratory feast, which she uses as an example of that, the French gastronomic meal, which we're going to watch this short film on in a second. Entrepreneurial feasts, and she uses her example of that, every year the salmon comeback feast. Patron feasts, and I had a particular example of this from my experience in Oklahoma, where in Kiowa and Comanche country during gubernatorial campaigns, one of the strategies, a common strategy that was duplicated by many gubernatorial candidates, I suppose, they would tour in Indian country out there, and they understood that the Kiowa and Comanche really liked beef, and prior to that, of course, had really liked bison. But anyway, part of what they would always do in their kind of tour and stump speech kind of route through that part of the state was they would throw a big kind of beef feast in order to, a patron feast, right? You're a governor, you're seeking a candidate for governor, and you're seeking votes. So you throw a big feast of foods that people really like, and then you think, in having done so, you probably have secured some votes along the way. So that's what the patron feast means. And then finally, there are these kind of exclusive feasts that are these kind of elite events that are intended for elite audiences and not for others. Okay, so this is the last slide. We're going to watch this film, and then we'll be done. All right, here we go. I do want to say real quick, in case this is not obvious, that the reason Crowther uses this example, and it's not the only one of these, there are several others. The cuisine of Mexico is another one, particularly Michoacan, the Mexican state of Michoacan. The French gastronomic meal is listed on UNESCO, that's the United Nations Environment, Social, and Cultural Organization, on the UNESCO list of intangible global heritage. Yeah. So, and that's what this short film is about. So we'll just watch it.
Whenever the French wish to celebrate a happy event in their lives, they gather around a table to enjoy what they call a repas gastronomique, or gastronomic meal. For 95% of French people, This type of meal is an essential part of their shared heritage and their cultural identity. In France, the gastronomic meal is a social custom that ritualizes the pleasure of being together. Preparing a gastronomic meal means enjoying the process of choosing recipes, shopping for the best products, cooking together. Inviting friends or family over for a gastronomic meal brings into play expertise and know-how, the art of ensuring their transmission, and joy. What will we serve? How will we share in the cooking? Who will do the shopping?
Une fois que vous avez mis à la poissonnière à la vapeur, vous laissez refroidir la peau avant qu'on Qu'est-ce que tu ferais, toi, avec l'amandine, aujourd'hui? Faut aller tout simplement.
When shopping, people exchange knowledge, give advice, and share cooking tips. The market is a place for conversation and transmission.
Bon appétit et cuisine bien. Merci. Allez, cherchez chez vous.
The French gastronomic meal also welcomes ingredients from foreign cultures. It leads to new discoveries, helps in accepting other cultures, and encourages the appreciation of diversity. It also reflects France's regional and geographical diversity through the many different products that make their way to the table.
Un rôti de veau. Un quasi de veau.
Mon propose, c'est de vous donner quelques os de veau à côté.
Ça va faire un jus onctueux avec la.
Voilà, et surtout un jus naturel de la bête.
Oui, très très bien.
On aurait besoin de temps.
Je vais proposer un petit plateau qui illustre ce qui est bon en cette saison.
C'est la bonne saison dans le sens où, en ce moment, en fin de printemps, début d'été, les animaux, les vaches sont dehors, elles sont dans les pâtures. C'est plutôt la période où les pâtures sont riches et bien parfumées.
Bonjour. Donc, on va attaquer par l'apéritif. Nous avons de mandarine. Ça, c'est un bon vin pour débuter un repas.
At last, friends and family have joined together to celebrate their gastronomic meal. Preparation begins.
Qu'est-ce que c'est comme pomme de terre? Donc ça s'appelle la princesse amandine.
Alors, est-ce qu'on frotte le plat d'ail? Ah bah ouais, quand même.
Et après, on va le couvrir d'une préparation qui sent bon, qu'on appelle un courbouillon. Voilà. Et après,
Souvent parce qu'il est fragile, très très fragile.
il se casse la gueule, regarde.
Allez.
Sortir sur les côtés. Je fais ça. Ça va bien se plier. Avec un glaçon. La bouteille qui est ouverte, tu mets un glaçon rouge, ça très bien rouge.
In every family, all over France, the same ritual is observed.
Se régaler ensemble, préparer le repas ensemble, échanger, et puis à partir de là, élargir la curiosité et peut-être l'éveiller.
Parents transmit to their children basic techniques and know-how. Peeling, trimming, cutting, making mayonnaise, tasting, again and again. Practice makes perfect.
Et mettre à l'intérieur.
Tu mets le jaune. Vas-y.
Tu tournes autour.
Voilà, mais. Voilà, ça c'est le geste essentiel.
Je vais les mettre là, d'accord?
La coupe en deux, et dans une assiette, tu commences à m'épépiner parce que c'est assez long.
On prend quelques heures comme ça, des fois, quand on prépare quelque chose, à la fin on se dit, ouais, c'est moi qui ai fait ça. Voilà.
Faire plein de desserts, faire plaisir à ma famille pour faire plaisir aux gens.
Of course, a gastronomic meal is not only about eating. It is a highly ritualized affair. Setting the table follows very strict rules. Children are taught how to fold napkins, where to place different kinds of glasses, and how to arrange the cutlery for the different services. Everything is ready. The cheeses are arranged on a platter and the wines are opened. The finest wines are carefully decanted. The French-style gastronomic meal is based on a sequence of services or courses. Apéritif, first course hors d'oeuvre, fish course, meat course, cheese course, and dessert. The ritual begins with the apéritif, or appetizer, to open the appetite. Each course is brought out separately and placed in the center of the table, like an offering. It is also a conversation piece.
Un velouté avec des hypercils.
Bon, est-ce que tu mets de la cannelle? Ouais, moi je voulais.
Il y avait un petit peu de cerfeuil. Ça fait un peu
Merci. Non, vous commencez à regarder, il y a une petite tombée.
As a symbol of sharing, the whole fish and the roast are ceremoniously presented and carved at the table.
Après, ça c'est le ça c'est Bon appétit. Bon appétit.
Délicieux. Ah bah tant mieux. Oh là là, je ne sais pas où tu vas chercher tout ça. Moi non plus.
As if with reverence, all conversation stops in the shared pleasure of the moment.
Dans la sauce, c'est les champignons qui sont là.
Un petit peu d'ail là.
Oui.
And to ensure a harmony of flavors, a different wine is proposed with each dish. Cheeses of various types and shapes are arranged on the cheese platter in a specific order. Each one is cut in a particular way to ensure that everyone will have an equal amount of rind and center. They are tasted beginning with the mildest and ending with the strongest. More than for everyday meals, desserts and sweets are always a part of a gastronomic meal. It's the pleasure of being together.
Mohamed, je m'occupe de mon neveu qui est à ma droite.
C'est bon?
A digestive liqueur or brandy ends the ritual as conversation continues around the table. So yeah, I think it's good to try to preserve the art of living, of well-being, of knowing how to eat. This really is a cultural phenomenon, a part of French culture, something that's been handed down generation after generation. Submitting it to UNESCO illustrates a certain determination to maintain its transmission and to orchestrate it a little more, because I'm afraid that in the years to come, we won't be able to do that by ourselves anymore. I think a UNESCO nomination like this is very important, not only for France, but for Europe, for the whole world. Yes, it's definitely part of our culture, of our heritage. It's a living heritage, an evolving heritage. So if UNESCO recognizes that, it's really a good idea. 99% of French people hope to preserve their gastronomic meal and transmit it to future generations.
All right, everybody. So as delicious and fun as all of that looked, it's perhaps a bit painful to watch right now as we're all sort of isolated and segregated in our social distancing standards. So that's all that I've got for this lecture. So if you're so lucky, go enjoy a meal with someone, and I will see you next time.